Imagine a world lost beneath the waves, swallowed by the ocean in a single night. A civilization so advanced that its memory has echoed across millennia, hidden in whispers, myths, and obscure texts. Atlantis, a name that evokes mystery, grandeur, and tragedy. Scholars debate whether it ever existed or was merely a parable of hubris. Yet some clues suggest that fragments of its knowledge and legacy survived, quietly influencing the course of human history. Centuries later, in the heart of early medieval Europe, a dynasty emerged whose origins were enigmatic and whose kings carried an aura of the extraordinary. They were the Merovingians. Chroniclers spoke of them in hushed tones, noting unusual traits, strange longevity, and ceremonial practices that set them apart. Legends hinted at a hidden inheritance, a bloodline that preserved knowledge from a world long lost beneath the sea. Could it be that the Merovingians were descendants of a civilization older than recorded history, tasked with carrying forward secrets too potent to be openly shared? This journey will weave between myth and history, tracing the faint echoes of Atlantis through the rituals, symbols, and lineage of the Merovingians. We will uncover hidden manuscripts, cryptic symbols, and sacred relics, examining how secret knowledge may have been preserved through centuries of upheaval. Every crown, manuscript, and ritual could hold clues to a civilization that refuses to be forgotten. Prepare to enter a world where myth bleeds into history, where kings may be more than they appear, and where the shadow of Atlantis lingers, guiding the destiny of those who carry its blood. This is a story not only of loss, but of preservation, secrecy, and the quiet endurance of wisdom through the ages. A story that begins with a sunken empire and continues through the enigmatic Merovingian Dynasty. For millennia, Atlantis has lingered at the edges of human imagination, a city described as dazzling, advanced, and tragically lost beneath the waves. Most are familiar with Plato's account, written more than 2,000 years ago, a civilization so powerful that it challenged the known world, only to be swallowed by the ocean in a single cataclysmic night. Scholars debate endlessly whether Plato's tale was literal history or merely an allegory warning against pride and ambition. But a growing body of esoteric thought and alternative research suggests that the story may contain fragments of a genuine historical memory, a shadow of a civilization whose sophistication has never truly been surpassed. Consider the details Plato provides. Immense cities built with extraordinary precision, canals cutting through urban landscapes, and a society organized with a sophistication far beyond what is attributed to the era. The descriptions are vivid, almost too vivid, suggesting not mere fiction but a preserved account of something real, perhaps altered through centuries of retelling. Outside Plato, there are hints in other ancient texts, obscure Egyptian and Sumerian references to lost lands and mysterious peoples of the deep that may corroborate the idea that Atlantis was not entirely imaginary. Even the linguistic echoes of Atlantean culture seem to appear in fragments across civilizations, buried beneath the surface of history and mythology. Many alternative historians argue that Atlantis was not simply a city, but a civilization that spread its influence far beyond its island. Its survivors, they suggest, carried knowledge with them. Advanced engineering, philosophical wisdom, astronomical observation, and perhaps even esoteric teachings designed to preserve their understanding of the natural and metaphysical worlds. If this were true, the collapse of the island itself would not signify the end of its influence, but the beginning of a hidden legacy, transmitted quietly through select lineages and secret societies. This raises a tantalizing question. Could one of those lineages have ended up in Europe, centuries later, influencing the course of medieval kingdoms? Could the myths of kings with mysterious origins, of bloodlines considered sacred or even divine, point to something more than mere legend? For centuries, Mainstream history has dismissed such ideas as fantasy, attributing them to superstition, misinterpretation, or imaginative storytelling. Yet, when patterns emerge, symbols repeated across cultures, unusual architectural choices, recurring mythological motifs, it becomes difficult to ignore the possibility that Atlantis' legacy may have persisted in subtle and deliberate ways. Beyond the textual evidence, some researchers point to geography and geology as silent witnesses to Atlantis. Ancient maps, such as those drawn by Pyri Reis or the fragmented fragments of the Turin Papyrus, hint at lands lost to rising seas or cataclysmic events. Archaeological anomalies, structures that defy conventional dating or construction techniques, suggest that humans may have possessed advanced knowledge long before recorded history allows. While skeptics attribute these to coincidence or exaggeration, proponents of the Atlantean hypothesis see them as breadcrumbs leading to a civilization whose memory refuses to die. Esoteric traditions provide yet another layer. Mystery schools, ancient brotherhoods, and occult texts speak of a great catastrophe and the preservation of sacred knowledge through select initiates. These are not merely fanciful tales, but part of a larger pattern suggesting intentional transmission of wisdom across generations. Could it be that Atlantis, rather than being destroyed entirely, survived in hidden forms? In the teachings of secretive orders, in cryptic symbols, in royal bloodlines that carried not just DNA, but encoded knowledge of a civilization lost to the seas? As we trace these threads, a subtle but persistent question emerges. Why would Atlantis, if it truly existed, leave traces only in myth and scattered symbols, rather than in continuous historical records? The answer, some propose, lies in concealment. Knowledge can be dangerous. Advanced technologies, philosophical insights, and spiritual understandings may have been deliberately hidden to protect them from misuse or to prevent societies unprepared for such power from destroying themselves. And in this light, the Merovingians, the kings described as semi-divine and mysterious, begin to appear not merely as rulers, but as potential custodians of a knowledge inherited from Atlantis itself. The connection is not immediately obvious. Atlantean myths and European medieval history are separated by millennia, geography, and culture. Yet when examined closely, curious parallels emerge. Both societies valued knowledge, secrecy, and symbolism. Both left enduring legacies that required interpretation and insight to fully understand. Patterns in rituals, architectural choices, and even numerology suggest that knowledge may have been intentionally encoded to survive beyond the collapse of empires and the erosion of time. It is within this subtle continuity that the possibility of a living Atlantean legacy begins to take shape. And so, the story of Atlantis transforms. It is no longer merely a tale of hubris and destruction, but the first chapter in a much larger narrative, a narrative that stretches across continents and centuries, linking a sunken world with medieval dynasties who may have inherited its secrets. As we move forward, the challenge will be to sift through myth, legend, and history to discern patterns that point towards something tangible. To ask not whether Atlantis existed, but how its influence may have quietly guided the destiny of those who walked the earth long after its supposed disappearance. In this space between legend and history, between skepticism and curiosity, we find the starting point of our journey. The hidden thread that may connect the lost civilization of Atlantis to the enigmatic kings of medieval Europe. It is a thread woven through symbols, texts, and whispers of secret knowledge, waiting to be followed, step by step, toward the hidden legacy that the world has almost forgotten. Across the rolling hills and dense forests of early medieval Europe, a dynasty arose whose presence was as enigmatic as it was powerful. The Merovingians, rulers of the Frankish kingdoms, were not merely kings. They were figures steeped in legend, shrouded in mystery, and described by contemporaries in terms that suggest a lineage far more extraordinary than the ordinary bloodlines of mortal men. Chroniclers of the time remarked on their unusual physical traits. Some described them as bearing a distinctive lock of hair, said to hold mystical significance, a mark that set them apart from other nobles. Their very appearance, their mannerisms, and their traditions exuded an aura of something beyond mere royalty. They were, in the eyes of many, semi-divine, a bridge between the human and the sacred, and perhaps custodians of secrets long thought lost to time. The Merovingians rose to prominence in the 5th and 6th centuries, a period of turbulence and transformation across post-Roman Europe. Amid the fall of the Roman Empire and the birth of new kingdoms, they consolidated power with a mixture of martial prowess, political acumen, and some suggest knowledge inherited from sources long forgotten. Unlike other dynasties, the Merovingians were associated not only with conquest, but with an almost mystical authority, a legitimacy that seemed to transcend politics. Legend suggests that their right to rule was not simply earned or inherited in the conventional sense. It was a sacred trust, a responsibility passed down through a lineage that may have originated far earlier than historians generally admit. The aura surrounding the Merovingians was amplified by the extraordinary accounts of their longevity. Several kings of the dynasty reportedly lived unusually long lives for the era, inspiring whispers that their blood carried a unique vitality, a secret inherited from their ancestors. Some medieval chroniclers even implied that their bloodline contained knowledge of the natural world, of healing, and perhaps of the cosmos itself. To modern eyes, these claims may sound fantastical, yet within the cultural context of the time, such attributes were considered signs of divine favor, or perhaps of an inheritance that stretched back to a civilization now lost. What, then, might this inheritance have been? One compelling theory links the Merovingians to the legacy of Atlantis. While it may sound improbable, consider the patterns. The Merovingians' obsession with symbols, the peculiarities of their rituals, and their penchant for secrecy all align with what one might expect of a lineage tasked with preserving knowledge too potent or dangerous to be widely shared. Their courts were filled not only with advisors and generals, but with scholars, scribes, and clerics, some of whom were guardians of obscure manuscripts and cryptic texts. These texts, carefully preserved, may have contained fragments of wisdom originating in a civilization long forgotten, a civilization swallowed by the sea, but not entirely erased from the human record. In addition to these texts, the Merovingians appear to have encoded secrets into the very symbols that marked their reign. The fleur-de-lis, so often associated with French royalty, may have been more than a decorative emblem. Some researchers suggest it carried hidden meanings, references to celestial cycles, or connections to lost knowledge. Similarly, other motifs found in coins, manuscripts, and even architectural features seem to reflect an understanding of sacred geometry, numerology, and cosmic order. These were not idle embellishments, but potential signposts, hints left for those with the insight to interpret them. The Merovingians' burial practices provide another clue to their enigmatic nature. Unlike other dynasties, they were often interred with unusual care, accompanied by objects and symbols whose purpose may have been ceremonial, mystical, or protective. Some tombs were constructed with alignment to celestial bodies, while others contained artifacts whose function has puzzled archaeologists for centuries. Scholars suggest that these practices were not merely expressions of piety, but deliberate acts designed to preserve knowledge, to maintain a link between the material and spiritual realms, and perhaps to safeguard a legacy too profound to be left to chance. Yet, for all their mystery, the Merovingians faced enemies both overt and hidden. Rival dynasties, ambitious nobles, and eventually the Carolingians would seek to overthrow them, erasing much of their influence from official records. This suppression, intentional or otherwise, only deepens the intrigue. When history is written by those who triumph, the records of those who guard secrets often vanish, leaving tantalizing fragments that hint at a far richer narrative. In the case of the Merovingians, what remains is a blend of documented history, legend, and myth, a mixture that invites speculation and rewards careful interpretation. The connection between the Merovingians and hidden knowledge also emerges in the way their reign intersected with sacred and esoteric traditions. Many of their ceremonies, rituals, and legal practices contain echoes of ancient wisdom, possibly remnants of teachings transmitted across centuries. The recurring emphasis on initiation, secrecy, and coded communication suggests a deliberate effort to preserve knowledge in a form that could survive political upheavals and the passage of time. In this sense, the Merovingians may have functioned as more than kings. They were custodians, stewards of wisdom inherited from civilizations whose influence stretched far beyond what we typically recognize in historical accounts. In exploring the Merovingians, it is essential to recognize the delicate interplay of fact, legend, and interpretation. They were historical rulers with tangible accomplishments, yet their story is layered with enigmas that challenge conventional understanding. To follow their lineage, to trace their symbols and rituals, is to peer into a world where history and myth intertwine. A world in which the possibility of a surviving Atlantean legacy cannot be dismissed outright. Each unusual custom, each mysterious artifact, and each chronicler's remark may represent a piece of a puzzle far larger than any single scholar has fully appreciated. As we continue, the Merovingians will emerge not just as rulers of a medieval kingdom, but as potential heirs to a knowledge so ancient that it predates written history. They stand at a crossroads between myth and reality, bridging the gap between a civilization swallowed by the sea and a medieval dynasty tasked with preserving its secrets. By understanding the Merovingians, we begin to glimpse a lineage that may carry the echoes of Atlantis itself, a bloodline whose mysteries remain tantalizingly just beyond the reach of mainstream history, waiting to be uncovered by those willing to look beyond the surface. The Merovingians were not only kings. They were custodians of a hidden language, a code woven into symbols, sigils, and sacred geometry that most eyes could see, but few could truly interpret. Across their coins, their manuscripts, and even the architecture of their sacred spaces, subtle signs hint at knowledge deliberately concealed, an inheritance passed down through generations that may have originated in worlds older than recorded history. The fleur-de-lis, their most famous emblem, is often viewed today as merely a symbol of French royalty, but some researchers suggest it was far more than decoration. Its 3 petals may have represented a trinity of wisdom, a celestial connection, or even a secret teaching carried from Atlantis through the veins of the Merovingian bloodline. Each curve and line could have encoded information intended to guide those initiated into its hidden meaning. Symbols like these functioned as silent guardians of knowledge. They were reminders that the kings themselves were more than political leaders. They were stewards of wisdom, entrusted with mysteries too profound to be exposed to the uninitiated. From the intricate designs etched into manuscripts to the recurring motifs carved into ceremonial objects, every detail seems intentional, deliberate, and meaningful. Some scholars argue that these symbols served as a bridge between tangible history and the spiritual knowledge of lost civilizations, a way to preserve memory across generations in a form that could survive conquest, upheaval, and time itself. Beyond the fleur-de-lis, the Merovingians employed other sigils and markings whose meaning remains enigmatic. Certain coins bear shapes and letters that appear nonsensical at first glance. Yet when examined through the lens of sacred geometry or numerology, they suggest knowledge of mathematical and cosmic principles. Temples, Churches and royal halls were constructed not only for function or beauty, but in alignment with celestial bodies, astronomical cycles, and numerological patterns, hinting at an understanding of the universe far beyond their apparent era. Could these alignments have been designed to preserve a secret knowledge, perhaps inherited from a civilization that once measured its cities not only by the human eye, but by the stars? Manuscripts from the Merovingian period contain similarly puzzling elements. Hidden within their illuminated letters and marginalia are symbols that appear to be more than decorative artistry. Some researchers propose that these were deliberately coded messages, designed to be interpreted only by those trained in the mysteries of the bloodline. Whether these symbols relate to ancient sciences, spiritual practices, or Atlantean knowledge, the consistency and recurrence of these motifs across centuries suggest deliberate preservation. The Merovingians may have been the keepers of a knowledge that could alter perception, a knowledge meant to survive even if its guardians were overthrown. The connection between symbols and bloodlines is particularly compelling. In many cultures, the preservation of sacred knowledge was entrusted to specific families or lineages. The Merovingians, with their semi-divine aura and mysterious origins, appear to fit this model. By encoding wisdom into objects, rituals, and art, they ensured that even if records were destroyed or history rewritten, fragments of their knowledge could endure. This may also explain why rival dynasties and emerging powers were so intent on erasing the Merovingians from history. What was being protected was not merely political influence, but a profound understanding of the world, a secret that, if revealed, could shift the balance of power. Some of these symbols seem to have connections far beyond Europe. Certain motifs and geometric patterns bear striking resemblance to those found in cultures as diverse as ancient Egypt, Mesopotamia, and even Mesoamerica. This raises tantalizing questions. Were these parallels coincidental, or do they hint at a shared source of knowledge? Could it be that the wisdom preserved by the Merovingians was part of a larger, ancient system, a network of knowledge that reached back to Atlantis, carried across continents and centuries through select families and societies? The recurring geometric forms, the hidden codes, and the celestial alignments all point toward a deliberate, intentional preservation, a silent testimony to a heritage almost erased by time. The deeper one delves into these symbols, the more they reveal a dual purpose, practical and mystical. On one level, they conveyed instructions, maps, or philosophical truths. On another, they served as a protective barrier, ensuring that the knowledge could only be accessed by those initiated, by those who understood the language of the signs. In this way, the Merovingians created a system of preservation that was simultaneously hidden and accessible, visible yet incomprehensible to outsiders. Every coin, manuscript, or architectural flourish becomes part of a larger tapestry, a secret map pointing toward knowledge too profound to be widely shared. Ultimately, the Merovingian symbols, sigils, and sacred geometry are not mere curiosities. They are evidence of a lineage that took its role as custodians of knowledge seriously. They suggest a deliberate and intelligent system designed to transmit wisdom, connect past civilizations with future generations, and protect secrets that could be dangerous if misused. Through these symbols, the Merovingians may have been silently guiding their descendants, leaving breadcrumbs that, if followed correctly, could reveal the hidden history of humanity itself. As we continue to trace the thread of hidden knowledge through the Merovingians, it becomes increasingly apparent that the symbols are not isolated anomalies, but integral elements of a much larger design. They are the language of a forgotten wisdom, a code left by kings who understood the fragility of history, the danger of ignorance, and the necessity of secrecy. In their art, their manuscripts, and their architecture, the Merovingians whisper across the centuries, hinting at a world beyond the surface of recorded history, a world where Atlantis' legacy may have endured in the bloodline of kings. Among the many legends that surround the Merovingian dynasty, none is as enduring or as enigmatic as the connection to the Holy Grail. This mysterious relic, long the subject of quests, myths, and whispered secrets, is often imagined as a cup, a chalice, or a vessel imbued with divine power. Yet, in the context of the Merovingians, the Grail may not have been a physical object at all. Some scholars and esoteric researchers propose that the Grail represents something far more profound, a symbol of a preserved bloodline, a carrier of hidden knowledge, and a repository of secrets inherited from civilizations lost to time, possibly even Atlantis. In this sense, the Grail becomes a key, not merely to wealth or divine favor, but to understanding the hidden currents of human history. The association of the Merovingians with the Grail begins with tales of kings whose right to rule was not simply a matter of inheritance, but of sacred lineage. Chroniclers and mythmakers alike describe these rulers as chosen, anointed by forces beyond the ordinary, carrying within their blood the memory of ancient wisdom. Could the Grail, then, be a metaphor for this lineage, a vessel of spiritual and intellectual inheritance rather than a simple cup of gold? Many of the Grail legends, particularly those emerging in medieval Europe, align with the notion that the Merovingians were more than temporal rulers. They were stewards of knowledge passed down through generations, guardians of a sacred legacy encoded in their very being. In examining the texts of Chrétien de Troyes and later Grail romances, one notices curious parallels between the Grail and the Merovingian kings. The Grail is often described as otherworldly, elusive, and accessible only to the worthy or the initiated. Similarly, the Merovingians were surrounded by secrecy, their rituals and symbols understood by few, their knowledge carefully guarded. Some interpretations suggest that the Grail was not lost or hidden in distant lands, but preserved through a bloodline designed to protect it. In this reading, the Merovingians themselves become the Grail, living vessels of wisdom, their lineage a bridge between the lost world of Atlantis and medieval Europe. The idea of a bloodline as a repository of knowledge is not unique to the Merovingians. Throughout history, secretive societies, priestly castes, and noble dynasties have maintained knowledge through family lines, understanding that wisdom could be diluted or lost if exposed too widely. The Merovingians' reputed longevity, unusual traits, and meticulous attention to symbolism suggest that they may have been aware of this responsibility. They were not simply kings defending territory. They were guardians of a legacy, encoded in their DNA, rituals, and traditions, a legacy that may have included knowledge of science, philosophy, and spiritual practice far advanced for their time. Certain medieval sources further suggest that the Grail had transformative properties, not in a literal, magical sense, but as a metaphor for enlightenment and initiation. The cup, chalice, or vessel becomes a symbol of potential, a means by which the worthy could access hidden truths. The Merovingians, as carriers of this secret, may have been both protectors and interpreters of these truths, ensuring that the wisdom of the ancients, possibly originating from Atlantis, remained intact despite the passage of centuries and the upheavals of history. Their courts, manuscripts, and sacred ceremonies may have been deliberately designed to encode and transmit this knowledge, using ritual, symbol, and story as a medium for preservation. Moreover, the Grail's connection to the Merovingians appears in the legends of quests and initiations. Knights, scholars, and mystics were said to seek the Grail, often guided by cryptic clues, sacred geometry, and esoteric teachings. This aligns closely with the idea that the Grail was never a simple object to be taken or possessed, but a set of hidden truths and a bloodline tasked with safeguarding them. The pursuit of the Grail may, in this sense, mirror the pursuit of knowledge itself, a journey that requires patience, insight, and an understanding of the hidden laws that govern the universe. Artifacts and relics associated with the Merovingians provide additional support for this theory. Crowns, ceremonial objects, and even burial practices suggest that the king's power was intertwined with sacred heritage. Some researchers argue that these objects were not mere symbols of earthly authority, but were imbued with meaning, acting as keys to the knowledge they protected. In this context, the Grail is not distant or mystical in the traditional sense. It is the knowledge embedded in the bloodline, accessible to those who understand its language of symbols, geometry, and ritual. The Grail legend also intersects with the concept of Atlantis in subtle but fascinating ways. If Atlantis represented a civilization of advanced knowledge, then the Grail could symbolize the continuity of that wisdom through time. The Merovingians, through their bloodline and their secretive preservation of symbols and teachings, may have been the bridge that kept the Atlantean legacy alive, hidden from those unready to receive it. Here, myth and history converge. A sunken civilization's knowledge survives, not in ruins beneath the sea, but in living guardians entrusted with its preservation. Finally, the enduring fascination with the Grail reflects a deep human desire to connect with lost wisdom, to uncover secrets that might illuminate the past and guide the future. By examining the Grail through the lens of the Merovingians, we begin to see a story not of simple quest or treasure hunting, but of a lineage charged with responsibility, of kings whose very blood may have carried the echo of civilizations swallowed by the tides of time. The Grail becomes a metaphor for survival, for preservation, and for the careful stewardship of knowledge too powerful to reveal to the world at large. Through this lens, the Merovingians emerge not merely as rulers, but as silent custodians, their reign intertwined with a legacy that stretches from Atlantis to medieval Europe. Their symbols, their rituals, and their bloodline itself may have been the true Grail, hidden in plain sight, preserved across generations, and waiting for those with eyes to see the continuity of a knowledge almost lost to history, but never entirely forgotten. As centuries passed after the supposed fall of Atlantis, whispers of its knowledge and influence seem to have persisted, hidden in fragments of myth, scattered relics, and the oral traditions of those who survived its cataclysm. Some historians and esoteric researchers argue that survivors of the lost civilization migrated to distant lands, carrying with them not only physical artifacts, but also the knowledge, rituals, and philosophical systems of a world far older and more advanced than the societies they entered. These remnants of Atlantean culture may have been quietly absorbed into the nascent kingdoms of Europe, waiting centuries to resurface in the rituals and traditions of lineages like the Merovingians. The Merovingians themselves provide curious evidence of this hidden influence. From their semi-divine aura to the strange longevity reported in certain chroniclers' accounts, their origins are difficult to trace using conventional historical methods. Some theorists suggest that they were descendants of an elite group that survived Atlantis' destruction, chosen to preserve its wisdom through centuries of upheaval. Their distinctive physical characteristics, such as the famed long hair of the kings, might have been more than hereditary quirks. In some interpretations, these were markers of a sacred bloodline, a visual code indicating connection to an extraordinary ancestry. In this sense, the Merovingians may have been not just rulers of their time, but guardians of a legacy stretching back to a civilization swallowed by the sea. Beyond bloodlines, the influence of Atlantean survivors may be traced in the ceremonial and cultural practices of early medieval Europe. Rituals involving sacred geometry, celestial alignments, and secret initiations appear to echo practices attributed to Atlantis in fragments of ancient texts and esoteric traditions. Architecture, too, offers subtle clues. Certain Merovingian-era churches and royal halls were constructed in ways that mirror cosmic patterns, suggesting knowledge of astronomy and spatial mathematics that might have originated far earlier than their era. These alignments, whether coincidental or deliberate, hint at a continuity of knowledge, a transmission of understanding that could only have survived through careful preservation. The notion of migration also offers intriguing parallels with myths and legends. Across Europe, tales emerge of lost peoples arriving from distant lands, often bearing advanced knowledge or mystical skills. Some accounts describe mysterious travelers who influenced the development of early societies, teaching arts, science, and spiritual practices. Could these stories be distorted memories of Atlantean survivors integrating into European culture, their influence so subtle that it escaped the scrutiny of mainstream historians? The Merovingians, situated at the intersection of legend and history, may be one manifestation of this hidden continuity. Artifacts and texts from the period provide further hints. Coins, crowns, and ceremonial items often bear cryptic symbols, patterns, and markings that echo designs found in ancient civilizations. Manuscripts contain marginalia and illuminations suggestive of esoteric teachings, preserved in coded forms. Even if these items appear mundane to the untrained eye, they may encode knowledge from a civilization whose sophistication was almost unimaginable to the societies that succeeded it. The Merovingians' careful use of such symbols suggests that they were not merely decorative or ceremonial, but part of a deliberate strategy to preserve wisdom across generations. Moreover, Atlantean influence may also explain the Merovingians' association with sacred authority. In many myths, Atlantis was not only technologically advanced but spiritually enlightened. Its rulers understood to possess both worldly and otherworldly knowledge. If survivors carried this understanding into Europe, it would explain why the Merovingians were often described in semi-divine terms, their right to rule viewed as ordained by forces beyond mere human institutions. They may have inherited not just blood, but philosophy, ritual, and the responsibility to safeguard a knowledge too potent to reveal freely. The interplay between myth and history is particularly compelling here. On the surface, the Merovingians were medieval kings, subject to the same political struggles, battles, and dynastic rivalries as any other rulers of their time. Yet beneath this exterior, subtle traces of ancient wisdom and Atlantean influence appear to persist. Rituals, architecture, and symbolic systems suggest that their world was suffused with knowledge of a far older civilization, transmitted through careful preservation and encoded into the very fabric of their rule. To see the Merovingians in this light is to see history not as a linear record, but as a web of continuity where fragments of lost worlds survive in ways both visible and hidden. Even mainstream records, while largely dismissive of esoteric interpretations, hint at unusual practices among the Merovingians. Their emphasis on secrecy, ceremonial complexity, and symbols that appear out of place for their time may be indirect evidence of a broader inheritance. These practices could have been strategies to preserve knowledge, ensuring that even if dynasties fell and histories were rewritten, the wisdom of a civilization swallowed by the sea might survive through encoded lineage, ritual, and artifact. Thus, the idea emerges that Atlantis did not vanish entirely. Its survivors may have carried fragments of its knowledge into the emerging kingdoms of Europe, and the Merovingians may have been among the first to receive, protect, and cultivate this inheritance. Through their bloodline, rituals, symbols, and governance, they may have subtly influenced the course of European history, preserving a hidden legacy that reaches far beyond their era. This continuity, hidden beneath layers of legend, political upheaval, and deliberate suppression, sets the stage for understanding the Merovingians not just as kings, but as custodians of a knowledge that stretches back to a sunken civilization. In following this thread, we begin to see how myths of Atlantis and the enigmatic practices of the Merovingians intertwine. The story is no longer merely about a lost civilization or a medieval dynasty. It is about the survival of wisdom, hidden in plain sight, transmitted through symbols, bloodlines, and secret teachings. Each ritual, each artifact, and each architectural choice may carry echoes of Atlantis, awaiting those with eyes to see and understanding to decode. It is here, in the convergence of myth, history, and hidden knowledge, that the journey truly deepens, leading toward revelations that challenge everything we think we know about the past. Walking through the ruins and remnants of Merovingian-era Europe, one cannot help but notice the meticulous attention to design, the precision with which sacred spaces were constructed, and the recurring patterns that echo far beyond the aesthetic. These are not mere coincidences. From the alignment of churches to the proportions of royal halls, it becomes apparent that the Merovingians operated with a profound understanding of geometry, cosmology, and the symbolism of the cosmos. Their architecture was not simply functional. It was deliberate, a coded language meant to preserve knowledge, perhaps inherited from civilizations that predated recorded history, civilizations that may have included Atlantis. Sacred geometry, the study of shapes, proportions, and patterns imbued with spiritual significance, emerges as a recurring motif in Merovingian constructions. Circles, squares, triangles, and complex polygonal forms appear not only in floor plans but in windows, murals, and ornamental carvings. These geometric patterns often correspond to astronomical cycles, suggesting an intimate knowledge of the heavens and their influence on earthly affairs. The precise repetition of these shapes implies intentionality. They were designed to encode information, convey hidden truths, and connect the human realm with the cosmic order. It is as if every stone laid, every arch curved, and every chamber aligned was part of a larger celestial narrative, a story whispered across time from those who understood the universe in ways modern observers struggle to grasp. The alignment of Merovingian churches with the solstices, equinoxes, and specific constellations further hints at a sophisticated understanding of astronomy. The positioning of doorways, the orientation of altars, and even the spacing of columns may have been intended to capture sunlight at precise moments, marking sacred time and creating spiritual resonance within the space. In this sense, architecture was more than shelter or display of power. It was an instrument of knowledge, a way to preserve and transmit wisdom through experience, observation, and ritual. These choices suggest a continuity of knowledge that may stretch back to Atlantean civilizations, where the observation of stars, planets, and celestial events was integral to the functioning of society and the transmission of knowledge. Even the layout of royal halls and ceremonial spaces offers clues to this hidden wisdom. Certain patterns, symmetry, proportional scaling, and axial alignments indicate that Merovingian rulers understood concepts of balance and harmony, both practical and symbolic. The dimensions of some structures correspond to numerical sequences considered sacred, echoing ideas found in Pythagorean and other ancient systems of geometry. This suggests that the Merovingians were not only preserving knowledge from their own time, but potentially carrying forward principles that originated in a far older, more advanced civilization. By embedding these principles into the very fabric of their constructions, they ensured that wisdom could endure even if the lineage itself faced threats or upheavals. The use of light and shadow in Merovingian architecture also reinforces the connection to hidden knowledge. Carefully placed windows, openings, and reflective surfaces may have been designed to create specific effects at certain times of day or year, revealing hidden inscriptions, illuminating sacred symbols, or marking celestial alignments. These interactions between light, structure, and space are reminiscent of ancient methods used in temples and ceremonial sites worldwide, from the pyramids of Egypt to the megalithic structures of Europe. Such techniques suggest a deliberate preservation of knowledge, a way to communicate truths through the very experience of entering and moving through sacred spaces. Artifacts within these architectural spaces provide further evidence of coded knowledge. Altars, stone carvings, frescoes, and mosaics often feature repeating motifs, geometric arrangements, and symbolic inscriptions. These may have served multiple purposes, as teaching tools, as protective charms, or as mnemonic devices to encode complex information about cosmology, mathematics, or spiritual philosophy. For those initiated into the Merovingian mysteries, these objects and spaces were likely more than decorative. They were repositories of knowledge, tools for meditation, ritual, and comprehension of universal principles. In this way, architecture itself becomes a form of living memory, a physical manifestation of wisdom passed down through generations. The parallels with Atlantis become particularly intriguing when one considers reports of Atlantean cities, as described by Plato and other sources, advanced urban planning, precise measurements, and alignment with celestial bodies. While we cannot definitively claim that Merovingian knowledge originated in Atlantis, the similarities suggest the possibility of a transmitted legacy. The Merovingians may have inherited fragments of this wisdom, preserving it through ritual, geometry, and architecture at a time when written texts alone could easily be lost, destroyed, or misunderstood. Their constructions, therefore, are more than monuments to power. They are encrypted repositories of ancient understanding, carefully designed to endure centuries of political upheaval and cultural change. The role of sacred geometry extends beyond practicality into the mystical and symbolic. Triangles, circles, spirals, and nested polygons have long been associated with spiritual truths, cosmic order, and the alignment of mind, body, and universe. By embedding these forms into their structures, the Merovingians may have been creating a bridge between the earthly and the divine, a method to maintain the integrity of wisdom across generations. The architecture becomes an initiation in itself, requiring observation, contemplation, and insight to fully decode the knowledge embedded within. In this sense, every church, tomb, or ceremonial hall is a silent teacher, whispering secrets to those attuned to its language. Even today, the subtle patterns embedded in Merovingian architecture invite speculation. Scholars and enthusiasts alike note recurring measurements, alignment anomalies, and symbolic flourishes that defy simple explanation. While some dismiss these as coincidence or aesthetic preference, the repetition, precision, and ritual context suggest otherwise. The Merovingians appear to have intentionally encoded knowledge into the very fabric of their world, preserving a lineage of understanding that may trace back to civilizations long lost to history. In studying Merovingian architecture, one begins to see history not as a series of events, but as a tapestry of encoded wisdom, a continuum in which structures, symbols, and spaces act as vessels for hidden knowledge. Each building, each hall, and each sacred site is a chapter in a story that stretches from Atlantis to medieval Europe, a story of preservation, secrecy, and intentionality. To walk through these spaces is to walk alongside the custodians of a hidden legacy, encountering the echoes of a civilization swallowed by the sea, whose wisdom may have been quietly shaping human understanding for centuries. Hidden within the dusty corridors of medieval libraries and the margins of ancient manuscripts lie hints of a knowledge deliberately concealed, secrets written for those capable of understanding their significance. Among these texts are prophecies and chronicles connected to the Merovingian kings, works that speak in riddles, allegory, and symbolic language. Far from mere entertainment or religious instruction, these writings may have served as vehicles for preserving wisdom too delicate or potent to be recorded openly. The visions of saints, the obscure annals of chroniclers, and the coded references in illuminated manuscripts all suggest a deliberate layering of knowledge. history intertwined with prophecy, myth entwined with reality, a hidden story waiting for those with insight to uncover it. Some of the most compelling manuscripts hint at the existence of a lineage aware of worlds beyond immediate human perception, a bloodline tasked with preserving truths from an age-long past. Among these are texts attributed to figures like Saint Bede, whose writings, while primarily historical, include cryptic references to rulers who carried the weight of secret wisdom. Other chronicles, often ignored or dismissed by mainstream historians, describe the Merovingians as custodians not merely of kingdoms, but of sacred knowledge, knowledge that connected their lineage to celestial cycles, ancient civilizations, and perhaps even the sunken world of Atlantis. These writings are fragmentary, often veiled in metaphor, but their recurrence across independent sources suggests a pattern that is difficult to ignore. Prophecies, in particular, form a fascinating link between hidden knowledge and Merovingian influence. They describe kings and rulers whose reigns were guided by divine insight, whose actions would either preserve or endanger a sacred legacy. Some prophecies speak of catastrophic events, upheavals in the natural and political world, and the rise of rulers bearing extraordinary traits. Taken literally, these may seem like superstition. Interpreted symbolically, they appear as encoded warnings and instructions, meant to guide successors in safeguarding knowledge that was potentially dangerous if misunderstood or misused. The prophetic texts thus serve dual purposes. They record historical memory and encode instructions, ensuring the continuity of understanding across generations. Hidden manuscripts also reveal surprising sophistication in both content and form. Illuminated texts often embed geometric patterns, alphanumeric codes, and subtle illustrations whose meaning is not immediately apparent. Some researchers argue that these features were designed to preserve cosmological, mathematical, and philosophical knowledge in a form that could survive centuries, even if the physical manuscripts were destroyed. Such careful preservation implies a profound understanding of how information could endure. Knowledge was not only written down, but encoded in layers of symbolism, accessible only to those trained to interpret it. The Merovingians, with their legendary attention to secrecy and ritual, were uniquely positioned to safeguard such texts, ensuring that wisdom from a lost civilization could persist in human memory. Among these manuscripts, certain themes recur with striking regularity: the rise and fall of dynasties, the alignment of rulers with celestial events, the moral and spiritual responsibilities of leadership, and the hidden continuity of bloodlines. These motifs suggest that the writers were aware of a larger framework, a hidden narrative that extended far beyond the events of their own time. Within these layers lies a subtle suggestion that the Merovingians were not ordinary kings, but part of a continuum of knowledge transmission, bridging the gap between the lost wisdom of ancient civilizations and the unfolding history of Europe. The deliberate obscurity of these texts is itself revealing. By disguising information in allegory, prophecy, and symbolic illustration, the authors created a system of knowledge that could survive centuries of censorship, conquest, and cultural change. The Merovingians' control over such manuscripts may have ensured that they remained hidden from the uninitiated while still accessible to those prepared to decode their meanings. This mirrors practices in other esoteric traditions, where sacred knowledge was transmitted selectively through apprenticeships, initiation rites, or secretive societies. In this light, the Merovingians emerge not merely as rulers, but as active custodians, ensuring that a legacy of wisdom, potentially including knowledge inherited from Atlantis, would endure despite the passage of time. Even the act of writing itself may have been ceremonial, part of a larger ritual designed to protect and transmit understanding. Illuminators, scribes, and chroniclers often worked under specific guidelines, embedding symbols, patterns, and numerological codes that reflected a hidden cosmology. Every letter, Every illustration and every pattern was potentially a key to deeper truths. For modern researchers and enthusiasts, these texts are tantalizing puzzles, suggesting that beneath the surface of history lies a network of knowledge deliberately encoded for preservation. Some researchers have drawn connections between these prophecies and later secret societies, suggesting that the manuscripts may have influenced groups like the Knights Templar or the Priory of Shaun. In this reading, the Merovingians' hidden knowledge was not lost after their dynasty waned. It may have been passed into new custodial hands, embedded in ritual, encoded in symbols, and preserved in ways that kept it out of mainstream awareness. The interplay between prophecy, manuscript, and lineage forms a web of continuity, linking the distant past with the medieval world and, possibly, with knowledge that predates recorded history itself. Ultimately, the hidden manuscripts and prophecies associated with the Merovingians invite us to reconsider what we accept as historical fact. They suggest that history is layered, with some information deliberately hidden to protect it or to ensure its survival. The prophecies and manuscripts serve as both guides and warnings, hinting at a broader narrative that connects bloodlines, civilizations, and knowledge across millennia. In this context, the Merovingians are not merely historical figures. They are guardians of a legacy that stretches far beyond the visible world, a living link to mysteries that may trace back to Atlantis itself. By following these cryptic texts, we begin to glimpse the invisible threads that connect lost civilizations, sacred bloodlines, and hidden wisdom. The Merovingians, through their manuscripts and prophecies, appear as both participants in history and stewards of something far larger, a continuum of knowledge that, while obscured for most, has persisted across the centuries, quietly shaping the destiny of those capable of perceiving its patterns. In the faint light of these hidden texts, the past speaks, hinting at secrets that, once uncovered, may forever alter our understanding of history, lineage, and the mysteries of civilizations long vanished. The idea of the Grail has always hovered between myth and memory, drifting through European tradition like a luminous thread that refuses to break. Most people today imagine it as a golden chalice or the cup used at the Last Supper, but the earliest stories never agreed on its form. In some texts, it was a stone, in others, a platter. Sometimes it shone like a meteor fallen from the heavens. Sometimes it appeared as a vessel of knowledge rather than an object meant to hold liquid. But beneath these shifting shapes, a single concept remains constant. The Grail was something that carried life, lineage, and a sacred inheritance. And it is in this deeper, more esoteric interpretation that the path leads directly back to the Merovingians, and, if the older theories are correct, far further back into the misty ancestry of an ancient, pre-flood civilization. When medieval writers began crafting the earliest Grail romances, they set the events in regions that were once heartlands of Merovingian rule. Ardennes forests, the Rhine Valley, the old Celtic fringes of Gaul. These were landscapes already layered with sacred history. Druidic groves, megalithic alignments, and Romanized kingdoms built atop even older strata of forgotten peoples. The authors seemed to know what they were doing. These weren't arbitrary settings chosen for color. They were the quiet echo chambers of a belief that something precious had once been guarded there. Something that was not merely holy, but carried living significance. Heritage, blood, continuity. The most provocative theory proposes that the Grail is not an artifact at all, but a symbol encoded into story to protect a forbidden truth. That a lineage of sacred kingship survived into medieval Europe, its roots stretching back to a prehistoric priest-king tradition. This interpretation leaps away from Christian relic lore and moves toward the concept of a family, not an object that bears a hidden essence. A vessel of knowledge rather than a cup, a bloodline rather than a chalice. The Grail family, as some esoteric scholars call it, could therefore be the literal carriers of ancient wisdom stretching back to Atlantis, or whatever real-world civilization may have inspired that legend. This interpretation gains peculiar strength when compared with Merovingian identity. The Merovingians often portrayed themselves not as ordinary kings, but as custodians of sacred continuity. Their long hair wasn't a fashion choice. It was the outward sign of spiritual authority. Their symbols, bees, serpents, triskelions, echo traditions that predate Christianity by thousands of years. And many of the regions later associated with Grail stories were precisely the same regions where Merovingian kings held court, where their tombs were found, and where legends about their supernatural origins circulated. If the Grail stories were intended to hide a truth in plain sight, their authors did it masterfully. Chrétien de Troyes, Wolfram von Eschenbach, Robert de Boron. These writers lived in a world where allegory served as armor. Knowledge could be disguised, encoded, buried beneath layers of metaphor. Wolfram's decision to describe the Grail as a stone rather than a cup may not have been a creative whim, but a deliberate shift toward an older symbol. In some ancient traditions, this stone is the thing that preserves a spark of divine fire, the seed of kingship, or the soul of a people. The Merovingians, with their hybrid sea-born origin story and their claim to an unbroken ancestral right, fit eerily well into this framework. Another layer emerges when examining the role of the Grail guardians. In multiple versions of the tale, a mysterious brotherhood protects the Grail, living apart from ordinary society. They are custodians rather than kings, watchers rather than rulers. This imagery matches accounts of real medieval groups, Templars, monastic orders, and possibly pre-Christian priestly remnants, who operated in the same regions and at the same time as the transition from Merovingian to Carolingian rule. It is almost as if the Grail romances served as a soft echo of something that had once been dangerous to discuss openly: the survival of an ancient tradition carried through select families and protected by secretive groups. There is also the odd fact that early Grail legends emphasize healing, renewal, and rightful kingship. The Fisher King is wounded, and the land becomes barren until the Grail is restored or rediscovered. This concept mirrors the Merovingian decline. Their removal by the Carolingians was followed by centuries of war, plague, fragmentation, and cultural loss. It's as though the story preserved a symbolic memory, that when the rightful inheritors of a sacred tradition fall, the land itself suffers. Whether taken literally or metaphorically, it is a striking parallel. Those who view the Grail as a bloodline rather than a physical object often highlight the theme of secrecy. Throughout medieval Europe, rumors persisted of families claiming descent from ancient priest kings, and some genealogies trace their lines back to the Merovingians. These claims were not always welcomed. Powerful institutions had strong incentives to suppress them, especially in eras when genealogy equated to legitimacy. In this context, the Grail could be seen as a safe way to discuss an unsafe idea. A lineage could not be openly protected, but a story about a mystical vessel could be. Connecting the Grail to Atlantis requires one more step: examining the symbolic overlap. In many esoteric traditions, Atlantis is not simply a lost city, but the memory of a civilization of enlightenment. Its leaders were depicted as possessing both wisdom and spiritual authority, a combination echoed in the Merovingian portrayal of their early kings. The idea of a fallen golden age, preserved through a surviving lineage that wandered the ancient world, eventually planting seeds in Europe, aligns with the Grail's narrative core, a sacred light carried forward through catastrophe and time. Even if Atlantis never existed, the myth encodes something older than written history: the belief in an ancestral memory of an advanced, maritime culture whose destruction scattered its people. If such survivors drifted into Atlantic Europe, Brittany, Gaul, the British Isles, their traditions might have merged with local tribes, eventually emerging as the cultural bedrock beneath Celtic myth and early Frankish lore. The Merovingians could then represent the final crystallization of a much older identity, and the Grail legends a safe vessel used to preserve their story after the dynasty itself was erased. In this interpretation, the Grail is not a relic waiting to be discovered. It is a symbol of memory, ancestral, genetic, mythic. It is the idea that a fragment of ancient knowledge survived the great cataclysms of prehistory, carried forward by people rather than objects. The Grail romances, written in the quiet halls of medieval Europe, may therefore be more than stories. They may be coded histories, whispering the survival of a forgotten world. The presence of the Knights Templar, the Cathars, and other medieval brotherhoods in the heartlands of old Merovingian territory has long stirred the imagination of historians and seekers alike. These groups appear almost like shadows cast upon the fabric of Europe, shadows that fall precisely in the regions where older mysteries were already deeply rooted. When the Merovingian dynasty faded from power, it was these later orders who seemed to inherit the landscape, the symbols, and perhaps even the secrets left behind. Whether intentionally or by circumstance, they became the guardians of forgotten lore, preserving fragments of knowledge that did not fit comfortably into the rising orthodoxies of their time. The Knights Templar, founded in the early 12th century, were ostensibly warriors sworn to protect pilgrims on the road to Jerusalem. But beneath that simple mission, their order grew into one of the most enigmatic forces in medieval history. They amassed wealth, influence, and, more importantly, information. Their network of preceptories spread across France, with a heavy concentration in the same regions where Merovingian kings had once ruled. This overlap has fueled speculation that the Templars were not merely military monks, but inheritors of an older tradition embedded in the soil long before their arrival. Many alternative historians argue that when the Templars excavated beneath the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, they were not searching for gold. They were seeking documents, relics, and traces of forgotten wisdom, perhaps even records of ancient diasporas that predated biblical history. If there had ever been a link between the Old World, the post-flood survivors, and the early priest-king bloodlines of Europe, it would be in such archives. The remarkable rise of the Templars after their time in Jerusalem suggests they found something that elevated them from humble knights to a near-autonomous power rivaling monarchies and the Church. When the Templars returned to France, they did not settle randomly. They deliberately anchored themselves in areas saturated with earlier sacred traditions: Burgundy, the Languedoc, the Loire Valley. Monolithic structures, ancient Celtic shrines, Merovingian grave sites, and Cathar fortresses formed a constellation of mystery across these provinces. Over time, a pattern emerged, a sense that the Templars were positioning themselves along a network of old power points, almost as if they were reconnecting the pieces of a forgotten map. Into this landscape also stepped the Cathars, an ascetic Christian movement that the Church labeled heretical. Yet the Cathars flourished for nearly 2 centuries in the Languedoc, living in a manner that seemed to echo older, pre-Christian spiritual philosophies. They believed in dual worlds, in spiritual purity, and the idea that certain souls carried a unique spark. Their faith was stripped of the dogmas that dominated the rest of medieval Europe, and their teachings were uncomfortably close to ancient Gnostic thought. The Cathars, like the Templars, occupied former Merovingian land. For generations, their communities lived along the same mountain paths and river valleys once walked by early Frankish kings. And when persecution finally descended upon them, it was said that something precious was spirited away from their stronghold in Montségur. A treasure, yes, but not one made of gold. Some say it was a book, others a relic, others still a set of genealogies or encoded documents that had been guarded since long before the Cathars themselves existed. The story is always vague but always persistent. They protected something entrusted to them, something dangerous to the authorities who sought to destroy them. The idea that the Templars and Cathars acted as custodians of ancient secrets is strengthened by their shared fate. Both groups were annihilated by the same forces, the rising centralized church and the monarchies aligned with it. The campaign against the Cathars was framed as a crusade, the Albigensian Crusade, which devastated southern France and sought to erase their teachings entirely. The Templars fell a century later, suddenly and violently, accused of impossible crimes that conveniently eliminated them as an independent power. The precision with which both were dismantled has led many to suspect that it was not merely spiritual disagreement that motivated their destruction, but fear that these groups had access to knowledge or claims capable of undermining the official narrative of power. One of the most intriguing theories is that the Templars held records proving a link between early medieval European bloodlines and a much older tradition of kingship, potentially tied to Atlantean survivors or proto-Celtic priest-kings. Such a connection, if made public, could have disrupted the Church's monopoly on divine authority and altered the political landscape of Europe. In this sense, the Templars may not have been merely guardians of relics, but custodians of a secret heritage whose revelation could shake dynasties. Legends abound of Templar vaults, hidden libraries, and underground tunnels beneath their commanderies where documents were sealed away before their arrest. Some stories place these treasures in the Pyrenees, others in Scotland, others beneath Paris itself. Though most are speculative, the consistency is striking. Everywhere the Templars went, they left behind rumors of hidden knowledge rather than hidden wealth. This intertwines curiously with the Cathar accounts of a perfect vessel or pure line, concepts that echo Grail symbolism. The idea that the Grail may have been an encoded representation of a bloodline or sacred heritage finds fertile ground here. If the Cathars and Templars were aware of such a lineage, possibly linked to the Merovingians, their clandestine protection of certain families or documents becomes plausible. They may have been guardians not of a cup, but of a story so old and transformative that it had to be shielded from those who would either misuse it or erase it. Some modern interpretations suggest that remnants of these traditions survived secretly through esoteric groups such as the Rosicrucians, Freemasons, or independent mystical circles in Europe. Though heavily mythologized, these claims reflect a persistent intuition that the suppression of the Merovingians did not extinguish their legacy entirely. Instead, that legacy went underground, carried by groups who sensed its value and meaning. Even the abrupt elimination of the Templars did not destroy their legacy. Many knights fled north to Scotland, Portugal, or remote pockets where sympathetic leaders offered refuge. In these places, their rituals evolved, their symbols merged with local lore, and their stories became more obscured but not forgotten. Their continued presence fuels the belief that they carried something intangible with them, a fragment of ancient truth that survived the fall of empires and the censorship of history. The convergence of all these elements, the Templars, the Cathars, the Merovingians, the hidden archives, the forbidden genealogies, creates the impression that medieval Europe was not a simple tapestry of kings and wars. It was a living palimpsest, a landscape where each new power structure covered but never fully erased the marks of something older. The guardians of forgotten lore moved quietly through this world, preserving what they could, hiding what had to be protected, and carrying forward whispers of a heritage rooted not in the Middle Ages, but in the dawn of civilization. The transition from the Merovingian world to the rising power of the Carolingians and the institutional church was not a simple political shift. It was a slow erasure, a deliberate reshaping of memory. The story is often told in clean lines. One dynasty fades, another rises. But beneath the surface, something more profound was happening. The Merovingians were not merely replaced. They were dismantled, discredited, and written out of the narrative with a precision that suggests more than political convenience. It suggests an ideological conflict, a clash of worldviews, and perhaps even a deeper rivalry over who held the right to define spiritual authority. For centuries, the Merovingian kings had claimed a unique kind of legitimacy, one not entirely based on conquest or inheritance, but something older. Their identity as long-haired kings was not symbolic alone. Their hair represented a sacred essence, a connection to an ancestral tradition that predated the church's authority by millennia. Their rule was intertwined with ancient customs, regional priesthoods, and local traditions that blended Celtic, Roman, and pre-Roman influences. They were kings who did not depend on the church to validate their right to rule. In many ways, they represented a parallel spiritual authority, one rooted not in scripture, but in blood, lineage, and tradition. This autonomy was always going to be a problem. As the church sought to consolidate its power across Europe, it needed a monarchy that aligned with its vision, one willing to accept the spiritual hierarchy it imposed. The Merovingians, with their aura of semi-divine kingship, their symbols of ancient origin, and their refusal to conform entirely, were resistant to such control. Their identity was tied to something older than Christianity itself, a heritage that made them unpredictable allies and dangerous opponents. The first cracks appeared not in grand confrontations, but in subtle manipulations. Court advisors, influential bishops, and political strategists began shifting loyalty toward the rising Carolingian mayors of the palace. Ambitious administrators who performed the real work of governance, while the later Merovingian kings, weakened by internal fragmentation, were increasingly sidelined. These shifts were not mere political accidents. They were part of a slow, methodical strategy to replace a dynasty that the church could not fully regulate with one it could. The Carolingians, unlike the Merovingians, sought legitimacy through the church. Their rise depended on clerical approval. Pepin the Short's decision to have himself anointed by church officials, breaking centuries of tradition, symbolized a new era. For the first time in Frankish history, kingship was defined by the church's blessing rather than ancestral right. The message was unmistakable. Spiritual authority no longer flowed from ancient lineage, but from a religious institution that now claimed the power to crown rulers. To ensure that the transition would not be questioned, the final Merovingian king, Childeric III, was deposed and forced into monastic life. His long hair, the symbol of sacred identity, was cut off, a ritualistic stripping of power more symbolic than any political decree. With that act, an entire worldview was meant to be extinguished. Yet the erasure did not stop at politics. It extended into chronicles, historical documents, and the language of the time. Chroniclers working under Carolingian influence portrayed the Merovingians as weak, lazy rulers, do-nothing kings unworthy of memory. The narrative was too consistent to be accidental. It was a rewriting of history designed to justify the shift in power and delegitimize the ancient lineage it replaced. The dynasty that had once united a vast territory and shaped the foundations of medieval Europe was reduced to caricature. Even the symbols associated with the Merovingians, bees, serpents, solar marks, were quietly removed or repurposed. The sacred objects found in their tombs were reinterpreted through a Christian lens or dismissed as pagan relics unworthy of attention. Their burial sites were left uncelebrated, their royal halls allowed to fall into ruin, and their genealogies obscured. It was not only a political transition, but an ideological cleansing. This suppression becomes even more intriguing when viewed beside the rise of groups like the Templars and the Cathars a few centuries later. These groups emerged in regions rich with Merovingian heritage, where ancient customs and alternative philosophies still lingered beneath the surface. Some researchers believe that remnants of the old bloodline, or at least the old belief systems, survived through local families or regional traditions, whispers of a sacred kingship that refused to die quietly. If so, The church would have had every reason to monitor, suppress, or absorb these remnants before they grew into a rival narrative. What makes the Merovingian erasure even more suspicious is how thoroughly the church integrated elements of older traditions into its own rituals. Practices associated with long-haired priest-kings, sun symbolism, sacred wells, and seasonal rites were absorbed into Christian festivals, rebranded, and appropriated. It is as though the church did not wish to destroy the old ways entirely, only to control them, strip them of independent authority, and ensure they no longer pointed to a lineage outside its sanctioned hierarchy. Some scholars propose that the Merovingians preserved knowledge inherited from earlier migrations, perhaps even from cultures connected with prehistoric megalith builders or survivors of pre-flood civilizations. If their dynasty represented not just a line of kings, but the remnants of an ancient priesthood tradition, then eliminating them would have symbolized more than a political victory. It would have severed Europe's connection to its oldest heritage, replacing it with a new order centered on ecclesiastical power. Stories passed down in local folklore suggest that not everything was erased. Certain families claimed descent from early Merovingian lines, preserving stories of secret births, hidden heirs, or children spirited away during times of political upheaval. Whether these tales hold literal truth or symbolic memory, they show that the dynasty left deeper marks on the cultural psyche than official records would admit. Even after their fall, the Merovingians continued to haunt the imagination of later mystics, esoteric writers, and secret societies. Medieval sects whispered of a lost king, whose blood carried an ancient spark. Renaissance scholars searched for hints of pre-Christian wisdom hidden in Merovingian artifacts. Modern writers have suggested that the dynasty might have preserved fragments of knowledge tracing back to civilizations long forgotten. And through all of this, the church's effort to reduce the Merovingians to obscurity stands out with curious intensity. It raises a quiet question: why was it so important to bury them? Perhaps the answer lies not in politics alone, but in the mystery of their origin, their symbols, and their spiritual identity, an identity that could not be molded or controlled by the new religious order. A lineage tied to ancient wisdom, to a time before centralized authority, could not be allowed to persist openly. And so, their memory was fractured, scattered into legend, stored away in the margins of chronicles, preserved only in the places where history's light fades and deeper shadows begin. Symbols often outlive the people who create them. They drift through time like seeds carried on the wind, settling into new cultures, new religions, and new stories. The Merovingians understood this better than most. Their identity was woven not merely through titles and territories, but through a tapestry of symbols whose origins stretched far deeper into antiquity than the dynasty itself. These symbols, bees, serpents, triskels, sun discs, and mysterious geometric patterns, carried echoes of ancient wisdom that predated the medieval world by thousands of years. When viewed closely, they appear less like ornamental emblems and more like clues to a forgotten inheritance. Among the most striking symbols associated with the Merovingians were the golden bees found in the tomb of Childeric I. Dozens of them, small, intricate, perfectly crafted, were scattered among his burial treasures. Archaeologists classified them simply as decorative ornaments, yet their presence remains puzzling. Bees do not appear as royal insignia in most early European dynasties, but in older traditions, especially those linked to the ancient Mediterranean and pre-Celtic Europe, bees symbolized resurrection, divine communication, and the continuity of a sacred bloodline. They were creatures that bridged worlds, emerging from the earth yet nourished by the heavens. In some traditions, the bee was associated with a priestess or oracle, the keeper of mysteries passed through generations. In others, it symbolized hidden knowledge, stored in the hive like secrets preserved for times of crisis. When Childeric's bees resurfaced after centuries of burial, they felt like a whisper from a forgotten world. Some researchers suggest the Merovingians inherited this symbol from ancient seafaring peoples who carried their beliefs across Europe long before written history began. If so, the bee would be a surviving fragment of an Atlantic tradition, one that might, in mythic terms, trace all the way back to an Atlantean priesthood. Another symbol threaded into Merovingian lore is the serpent. Medieval chroniclers described Merovec, the mysterious figure from whom the dynasty took its name, as having a dual origin, partly human and partly from an aquatic or serpent-like being that emerged from the sea. Whether literal myth or encoded metaphor, the image resonates with ancient depictions of serpentine wisdom-bringers, beings who emerge from water, impart knowledge, and establish lines of kings. This motif appears in Mesopotamian legends, in early Celtic lore, and in stories from even older maritime cultures. The serpent, in these traditions, is not a creature of evil, but a symbol of knowledge, transformation, and primordial memory. Some Merovingian seals and artifacts show intertwined serpents or serpent-like motifs reminiscent of Bronze Age designs found along the Atlantic coastline. These links are subtle yet persistent, suggesting that the dynasty continued a symbolic language inherited from prehistoric tribes whose beliefs fused with later Celtic and Frankish traditions. If the Merovingians indeed represented the last visible heirs of a forgotten priest-king lineage, the serpent could symbolize their connection to that ancient wisdom, a thread preserved across millennia. The triskelion, a three-armed spiral symbol, appears frequently in regions associated with early Merovingian presence. Though not exclusive to them, its recurring use in their territories hints at cultural continuity rather than coincidence. The triskelion is one of the oldest symbols in European prehistory, appearing in Neolithic art, Celtic stone carvings, and Bronze Age artifacts. Its meaning is fluid, cycles, motion, rebirth, the triadic nature of existence. But within the context of Merovingian symbolism, it may represent the survival of ancient cosmological knowledge, the same knowledge encoded in megalithic structures aligned to solstices and star paths. Sun symbols also appear around Merovingian sites, echoing the solar worship that dominated many pre-Christian societies across Europe. While the Carolingian world embraced the cross as its central icon, the Merovingian symbolic repertoire remained closer to the earth, the sea, and the sky, older forces untouched by later dogma. Even the long hair of Merovingian kings, described as sacred and never to be cut, carries symbolic meaning. In many ancient cultures, hair represented spiritual vitality, ancestral memory, and divine right. The Merovingians preserved this ritual long after other European dynasties abandoned similar traditions. When these symbols are placed together, they form a mosaic that feels deliberate, cohesive, and ancient. They point to a worldview that combined natural forces, celestial observations, and a belief in lineage as a sacred vessel. A worldview that contrasts starkly with the rigid theological structures emerging under the Church's authority. After the fall of the Merovingians, these symbols did not disappear. Instead, they migrated quietly, subtly, into other traditions that operated on the fringes of accepted history. The Templars adopted symbols reminiscent of bees and serpents in their architectural designs and seals. Some Templar chapels featured star alignments and spiral carvings evocative of megalithic structures. The Cathars revered ideas associated with purity, lineage, and hidden knowledge, echoing the same symbolic lineage. Later still, during the Renaissance and Enlightenment periods, esoteric groups such as Rosicrucians, alchemists, and early Masonic lodges incorporated variations of these symbols into their own systems of knowledge. Not because they understood their full origins, but because the power of the symbols persisted. They vibrated with an ancient resonance, that scholars could sense even when their original meaning had long faded. The bee resurfaced centuries later when Napoleon adopted it as his personal emblem, an act that puzzled historians. Napoleon could have chosen any symbol for his imperial identity, yet he selected one tied so intimately to the earliest kings of France, almost as if he sought to reclaim a lost heritage or invoke the legitimacy of a dynasty erased long before his time. Serpent motifs, triskels, and solar imagery likewise appear in modern esoteric and occult systems, suggesting that the symbolic vocabulary of the Merovingians continues to ripple through history like a faint signal. What makes these symbols especially compelling is how they align with theories of a much older civilization, one that may have existed before the great cataclysms at the end of the last ice age. Cultures across the world share symbols remarkably similar to those found in Merovingian contexts: spirals, serpents, solar wheels, and sacred animals like bees. This global pattern has led some researchers to speculate that these motifs were inherited from a single ancient source, a civilization that spread its influence before disappearing beneath rising seas or crumbling into myth. If such a culture existed, the Merovingians may have preserved its symbols even after its memory was lost. The symbols they left behind were not random decorations. They were subtle statements of identity, markers of continuity, and fragments of a memory too old to express in words. Whether the Merovingians consciously preserved this heritage or simply inherited it through cultural diffusion, the effect is the same. Their symbols point toward a lineage that reaches far beyond medieval Europe, back into the deep, shadowed epochs of human history when myth and memory were not yet separate. Stories have a strange way of surviving even when their original context has been erased. They migrate through generations like living organisms, adapting, reshaping, and attaching themselves to new environments. The legends surrounding Atlantis follow this pattern with uncanny persistence. Whether one views Atlantis as a literal place, a symbolic myth, or a memory preserved through ancestral storytelling, its imprint on Western imagination is undeniable. The most curious aspect of these legends is not the island's grandeur, but the remarkable consistency of themes across cultures separated by vast oceans and epics. The echoes of a lost advanced civilization occur not only in Greek writings, but in mythologies from the Near East, Europe, and even the Atlantic tribal traditions. These parallels prompt a deeper question. Could the people remembered as Atlanteans have influenced early populations that later seeded dynasties, such as the Merovingians? The earliest written account of Atlantis comes from Plato, yet the philosopher emphasized that he was relaying a much older Egyptian tradition. According to his text, the story itself had been preserved through centuries before reaching Greek ears. Egypt, in turn, often pointed to its knowledge as inherited rather than originated, referencing forgotten ages when gods, semi-divine rulers, and mysterious teachers walked among humans. The idea that a powerful maritime civilization might have existed before known history was not unusual in ancient memory. Many cultures spoke of a catastrophic flood that wiped away an earlier world, whether literal or metaphorical. This shared memory hints at an event real enough to sear itself into the collective consciousness. If Atlantis was not merely a metaphor, it likely represented a seafaring culture with advanced understanding of navigation, astronomy, and engineering. Such a society would have traveled widely, establishing outposts, teaching local tribes, and leaving behind symbolic fragments of its worldview. If survivors escaped a cataclysm, they might have settled along the Atlantic coasts of Europe, integrating with indigenous populations. Over generations, their distinct identity would have faded, but their ideas could have persisted, encoded as sacred symbols, star myths, and priestly traditions carried forward by select lineages. Some researchers argue that the similarities between Atlantean descriptions and early European megalithic builders are more than coincidence. The engineering precision found in ancient stone circles, burial chambers aligned to celestial events, and large-scale construction techniques suggests a culture with sophisticated astronomical knowledge. These structures appear suddenly. Around the same period, worldwide traditions describe a great destruction. It is not unreasonable to imagine that survivors of maritime collapse might have brought this knowledge northward, seeding the cultures that later evolved into Celtic and Proto-Frankish societies. The Merovingians, emerging from these regions, may have inherited this ancient legacy without fully understanding its origins. Legends surrounding the founding of the Merovingian line contain motifs reminiscent of myths attributed to semi-divine or wisdom-bringing ancestors from lost civilizations. The story of Meroveca's conception, where his mother encounters a mysterious being from the sea, mirrors ancient tales in which sea-born deities or survivors from sunken lands intermix with human tribes. In mythic language, beings from the sea often represent outsiders arriving by ship rather than literal sea creatures. If a group of highly skilled navigators arrived after a cataclysm, local tribes might later retell the encounter in symbolic terms. Over time, the story transforms into myth, disguising its historical kernel beneath layers of allegory. Another connection lies in the shared emphasis on sacred lineage. Atlantean rulers, as described in Plato's account, governed through a bloodline believed to be ordained by divine forces. The Merovingian kings, too, were believed to possess a mystical inheritance, one that granted them legitimacy beyond political structures. Their long hair, left uncut as a mark of spiritual authority, may reflect an ancient ritual linked to priest-kings of pre-catastrophe traditions. Hair in many cultures symbolizes memory, spiritual power, and continuity. If the Merovingian line was preserving an old symbolic practice, it might be a faint remnant of customs belonging to a forgotten maritime elite. The most intriguing parallels, however, appear in the symbols shared between Atlantean lore and Merovingian artifacts. Spirals, solar discs, serpentine motifs, and sacred animals like bees appear in both contexts, suggesting a continuity of symbolic language. The triskelion, for instance, is found in European megalithic sites, often associated with ancient seafarers. If such symbols were carried by survivors who integrated into early European tribes, they could have been adopted by emerging dynasties seeking to legitimize their rule through ancestral mystique. Even if later generations no longer remember the origin of these symbols, their presence would continue to shape cultural identity. The idea that a hidden lineage might extend from a primordial civilization to medieval monarchs is often dismissed as romantic speculation. Yet history frequently reveals unexpected threads connecting distant eras. After the Merovingians were displaced, their symbols and myths did not vanish. Instead, they reappeared in groups obsessed with preserving ancient knowledge: the Templars, Cathars, and later esoteric societies. These groups were often accused of possessing secrets considered dangerous or heretical. While much of their lore has been distorted by time, one recurring theme persists: the belief that ancient wisdom survived through chosen bloodlines and symbolic traditions. If some fragment of Atlantean heritage existed within Europe, it would not necessarily appear as a pure surviving people, but as scattered embers carried through myth, ritual, and symbols. The Merovingians, occupying a landscape rich in prehistoric monuments and ancient cultural memory, may have inherited these embers more directly than most. Their dynasty emerged not as a sudden invention, but as a continuation of identities shaped by millennia of cultural layering: Celtic, Germanic, Gallo-Roman, and perhaps something even older, something rooted in prehistoric seafaring cultures displaced by catastrophe. The persistence of Atlantean-like myths in regions once ruled by the Merovingians is also noteworthy. Throughout France and Western Europe, folktales speak of sunken kingdoms, ancient gods who guided early tribes, and mysterious builders who raised stones with knowledge now lost. These stories often cluster around coastal areas, river routes, and megalithic landscapes, precisely the zones where a migrating maritime culture would have settled. The Merovingian kingdom grew atop this earlier cultural substrate, inheriting not only political territory, but the mythic geography beneath it. Over time, the idea of Atlantis transformed into metaphor, symbol, and archetype. But myths do not survive through millennia unless they encode something meaningful, whether historical, spiritual, or psychological. When the Merovingians used symbols that mirrored those associated with vanished ancient cultures, they were participating, perhaps unknowingly, in a much older story. A story of lost wisdom, shattered civilizations, and the enduring quest to preserve fragments of truth across the ages. Whether Atlantis existed as an actual place or serves as a memory of humanity's forgotten past, its echoes can be traced in the traditions, symbols, and legends of lineages like the Merovingians. The connection may not be literal, but it is profound, an inheritance of mythic resonance rather than geography. In this sense, the Merovingians represent a bridge between the known history of Europe and the shadowed epochs that preceded recorded civilization, carrying forward whispers of a world long drowned, yet never entirely silenced. Across the landscapes once ruled by the Merovingian kings, a quiet network of legends persists, stories whispered in monasteries, encoded in medieval manuscripts, or hidden in the margins of illuminated texts. These stories hint at a knowledge older than Christianity and deeper than recorded European history. They speak of guardians, watchers, and secret transmitters of wisdom who moved silently across centuries, preserving fragments of a forgotten world. Whether these guardians were real individuals or symbolic constructs, their presence forms a thread that binds the Merovingian dynasty to a far older and more enigmatic legacy. The early medieval period was not as dark or disconnected as it is often portrayed. Beneath the surface chaos of tribal migrations and collapsing empires, monastic communities served as sanctuaries of learning, inheriting traditions from Roman, Celtic, and even pre-Roman cultures. Some monasteries were built atop ancient sacred sites that predated Christianity by thousands of years, suggesting an intentional continuity rather than mere convenience. In these secluded places, scribes copied texts that blended Christian doctrine with fragments of pagan cosmology, astronomical knowledge, and symbolic systems whose origins remain obscure. It is within these spaces that the first hints of a hidden lineage begin to emerge. Monks in certain regions openly acknowledged older influences in their chronicles. They wrote of mysterious teachers who arrived long before the Franks, bringing astronomical understanding and sacred geometry. These figures were later folded into Christian interpretation, sometimes reimagined as saints, sometimes as fallen angels, and sometimes as ambiguous culture bearers. Their teachings were said to be carried forward by select families who retained the duty of safeguarding ancient wisdom. The Merovingians, ruling over lands rich with megalithic monuments and pre-Christian shrines, were naturally linked to this tradition. Their bloodline was believed to hold something unusual, an ancestral memory or spiritual authority that set them apart from other rulers. What makes this connection compelling is the persistence of esoteric symbolism surrounding the Merovingian kings. Their emblem, the bee, for instance, appears in contexts far older than the dynasty itself. Bees were sacred to ancient priesthoods across Eurasia and North Africa, symbolizing resurrection, communication between worlds, and the preservation of hidden knowledge. Egyptian pharaohs used bees to signify rulership over Lower Egypt, and certain Greek mystery schools associated bees with initiates capable of navigating spiritual realms. When Napoleon later adopted the bee as a symbol, claiming to revive an ancient French imperial lineage, He may have been tapping into this deeper symbolic reservoir rather than simple medieval heraldry. Other symbols associated with the Merovingians carry similar weight. The recurrent use of the fleur-de-lis, though later adopted by the Capetians, has roots in fertility rites and ancient depictions of divine authority. The long hair of Merovingian kings, left uncut as a mark of sacred power, mirrors practices of prehistoric shamanic leaders. Long hair, in ancient cultures, symbolized a connection to the divine or to ancestral spirits. Even the ritual objects discovered in Merovingian burial sites, intricately carved talismans, unusual patterns of grave goods, and symbols suggesting solar and lunar cults, point toward a syncretic blend of Christian and far older traditions. Yet symbolism is only one part of the picture. The medieval obsession with secret bloodlines, particularly in the regions once dominated by the Merovingians, suggests an undercurrent of belief in hidden descent. Chroniclers from the 9th and 10th centuries wrote cryptic passages describing the dynasty as descendants of ancient kings from beyond the sea. Although the phrasing might be hyperbolic or metaphorical, it echoes myths that recall pre-cataclysmic seafarers or culture bringers associated with Atlantis-like civilizations. Whether intentionally or by coincidence, these chronicles place the Merovingians within a mythic framework stretching back to a forgotten age. The disappearance of the Merovingian line from political power did not erase their mythic presence. On the contrary, it intensified it. When the Carolingians rose and replaced them, the sudden shift generated questions that chroniclers struggled to answer. Why remove a dynasty believed to possess sacred legitimacy? Why cut the hair of a Merovingian king before dethroning him, as if stripping away divine status? Such actions suggest a symbolic severing, an attempt to break a lineage whose authority was rooted not only in politics, but in something deeper, something the new rulers feared or sought to suppress. As centuries passed, new groups began to surface that seemed to carry echoes of this older tradition. The Knights Templar, for example, emerged in territories steeped in Merovingian history. Their sudden rise to power, their mysterious patronage, and their interest in esoteric symbolism raised questions about whether they inherited traditions associated with pre-Christian wisdom. Some of the earliest Templars came from families and regions once ruled by Merovingians, and certain legends claimed they sought relics or manuscripts linked to forgotten lineages. Whether these stories have factual basis or are later romantic inventions, the association between Templars and ancient wisdom was strong enough to endure through centuries of storytelling. Other groups, such as the Cathars in southern France, also appeared to preserve elements of pre-Christian cosmology. Their dualistic beliefs, veneration of knowledge, and abrupt eradication by church authorities fueled speculation about hidden connections to older traditions. The regions they inhabited overlap with areas where Merovingian kings once held sway and where ancient megalithic structures still stand. The possibility that these groups preserved fragments of ancient teaching, passed down through generations of guardians, adds a layer of intrigue to the Merovingian legacy. Even in the Renaissance and Enlightenment periods, secret societies emerged that claimed descent from shadowed lineages predating European monarchies. Some of these societies used symbols directly linked to Merovingian iconography, while others referenced lost wisdom from the Western Isles, an unmistakable allusion to Atlantis-like traditions. Although most such claims are unverified, their persistence demonstrates the enduring allure of the idea that an ancient, hidden wisdom survived beneath the surface of European history. By the modern era, the idea of a hidden lineage connected to Atlantis, ancient priesthoods, and European dynasties had transformed from monastic whispers into a sprawling, esoteric tradition. Writers, occultists, and historians began combing through archives in search of clues. Some found patterns in architecture, sacred geometry, or medieval manuscripts. Others traced genealogies, attempting to map forgotten lines of descent. Still others examined myths and folk tales, discovering recurring motifs that seemed too consistent to dismiss. What emerges from this tapestry of symbols, legends, and hidden traditions is not a clear historical proof, but a compelling narrative. The idea that knowledge older than recorded history survived through select families, guarded by monastic scribes, transmitted by secret groups, and encoded in the very symbols of medieval kings. The Merovingians occupy a central position in this narrative, not as isolated rulers, but as inheritors of a deeper, more mysterious legacy. Whether this legacy is literal or symbolic matters less than the fact that it continues to captivate imaginations. The notion that a forgotten civilization, perhaps remembered as Atlantis, passed fragments of its wisdom into early European lineages offers an alluring bridge between myth and history. It suggests that the past is far more interconnected and layered than mainstream narratives acknowledge. And it keeps alive the possibility that traces of an ancient world, drowned but not forgotten, survive in the symbols, stories, and lineages woven into Europe's medieval past. In the quieter corners of Europe's historical record, one encounters a recurring theme that feels almost like an echo from a forgotten world: the idea of hidden cartography. It is the belief that certain maps, ancient, mysterious, and carefully guarded, record knowledge far older than the civilizations that supposedly created them. These maps, or fragments of maps, appear intermittently across centuries, often penned by navigators or scholars who openly admit they were copying from much older sources. If the Merovingians, or those who influenced them, preserved remnants of a lost maritime civilization, then its memory might survive not in grand monuments or public inscriptions, but in the subtle lines of forgotten coastlines traced on vellum or carved into stone. Long before the age of exploration, medieval mapmakers created representations of the world that included islands, continents, and coastlines that should not have been known to them. Some maps depict territories uncharted for many centuries afterward. Others show landforms as they would have appeared thousands of years before known history. Scholars debate whether these anomalies represent imagination, coincidence, or access to now-lost sources of knowledge. Yet in the context of a forgotten seafaring civilization, one whose survivors might have carried their memories into early European nobility, such anomalies gain new significance. Consider the strange persistence of an island or landmass in the Atlantic in several medieval and Renaissance maps. Sometimes labeled as Antilia, sometimes as High Brazil, sometimes unnamed altogether. This landmass appears inconsistently, but with enough regularity to suggest a shared source. Legends surrounding these phantom islands share uncanny resemblance to Platonic descriptions of Atlantis, flourishing lands with advanced cultures, later swallowed by the sea. Medieval sailors claimed to glimpse such islands in the distance, only for them to vanish upon approach. While these testimonies can be dismissed as illusions or misinterpretations, they reflect a collective memory that seems too coordinated to be purely coincidental. In monastic archives across France, Spain, and Ireland, regions historically linked to early Irish monks, Frankish scribes, and Proto-Celtic cultures, there are references to ancient charts said to have been inherited rather than created. Records describe them as fragile, fragmented, or too worn to be fully deciphered. A few chroniclers mention that the knowledge behind these maps came from the Old Ones, a phrase used in medieval texts to signify an earlier race or forgotten civilization. Though these references are veiled in ambiguity, they hint at a belief that some maps were older than Christianity itself, tracing routes known to ancient mariners who had long vanished. Another intriguing artifact is the Portolan chart tradition. These sea charts, appearing suddenly in medieval Europe with remarkable accuracy, seem to have emerged fully formed, without an observable developmental history. Traditional cartography evolves gradually, with mistakes corrected over time. Yet Port-Ohlon charts exhibit sophisticated precision from the moment they appear. Their compass roses, radiating in perfect geometric harmony, suggest a deep understanding of navigation, Earth curvature, and geometry. Some scholars propose that their creators, or the sources they borrowed from, possessed knowledge inherited from older seafaring cultures. If such a culture had once dominated the Atlantic, as Atlantis legends imply, then fragments of its navigational science might have filtered down into these medieval maps. Furthermore, there are peculiar alignments between megalithic sites across Western Europe and ancient sailing routes inferred from these early charts. Certain points on the maps correspond to stone circles, dolmens, and ritual landscapes that predate written history. Some theorists argue that the megalithic builders were navigators who marked terrestrial points corresponding to celestial observations and maritime routes. If even a fraction of this hypothesis is true, then medieval maps may have preserved the oceanic knowledge encoded in megalithic architecture, knowledge that the Merovingians, ruling over these lands, likely inherited through local traditions and sacred lore. More intriguing still are claims that certain early maps depict coastlines as they existed before the end of the last ice age. These claims remain controversial, but the possibility hints at something extraordinary. If accurate, such depictions would require knowledge far older than any known civilization. Some point to these anomalies as evidence that early European elites had access to ancient maps passed down from a forgotten epoch. The Merovingians, positioned within a web of ancient cultures and mythic inheritance, could have been one of the custodians of such knowledge, or at least beneficiaries of traditions that preserved echoes of it. When examining Merovingian territories, one finds regions dense with prehistoric structures whose orientations align with ancient maritime paths. The coasts of Brittany, Normandy, and Aquitaine were once hubs for seafaring tribes long before Roman records. These tribes left behind stone markers, burial mounds, and astronomical alignments that could have served as both spiritual and navigational tools. If the survivors of a maritime catastrophe, remembered poetically as the sinking of Atlantis, settled along these coasts, their knowledge might have interwoven with local traditions, passing silently through generations until re-emerging in early medieval cartography. More speculative theories suggest that certain maps were encoded with symbols or geometric shapes that reveal hidden information only to those trained to interpret them. For example, some cartographers embedded sigils, runes, or constellational references into their artwork. While mainstream scholars interpret these as decorative flourishes, esoteric researchers argue they represent an encrypted language signaling an ancient heritage. If so, these symbols might function as a visual lineage, an alternative genealogy of ideas tracing back to a forgotten world. There is also the enigmatic phenomenon of star maps found in medieval manuscripts. Some contain constellations accurately depicted in positions corresponding not to the medieval sky, but to the sky of 10 or 12,000 years earlier. These temporal discrepancies have fueled debates among historians and astronomers alike. Did medieval scribes simply copy older sources without understanding their age? Or did certain lineages within Europe preserve knowledge from a prehistoric epoch when the stars themselves occupied different positions in the heavens? If the Merovingians were linked to such knowledge, whether through ancient bloodlines, inherited traditions, or territorial proximity, then the maps that survived into the medieval world might be the last traces of an advanced maritime culture destroyed by cataclysm. The dynasty itself may not have fully understood the significance of these relics. Their role might have been that of passive custodians rather than active interpreters. Yet their symbols, myths, and geographic territories aligned suspiciously well with regions where ancient navigational knowledge once flourished. One cannot overlook the psychological power of maps. They are more than tools for navigation. They're expressions of how a culture understands the world. A map drawn from memory carries a fragment of the world that created it. A map copied from an ancient civilization carries the imprint of minds long gone but not forgotten. If survivors of Atlantis, or any lost maritime civilization, managed to preserve their geographic knowledge, it would manifest not as full-blown instructions, but as fragments, half-remembered forms, misplaced islands, and curious coastlines. In this sense, the maps of medieval Europe may be the ghostly fingerprints of an older world. A world whose people charted the oceans before history began. A world remembered in myth, symbol, and hidden lineage. And a world whose last whispers may echo through the obscure cartographic traditions inherited by early European dynasties like the Merovingians. There comes a moment in any long investigation where scattered fragments, half-whispered legends, and obscure symbols begin to align, not into a definitive answer, but into a shape, a silhouette of something vast and ancient that once stood whole. As the pieces converge, one begins to sense a deeper continuity beneath the surface of European history, a quiet pulse connecting prehistoric megaliths, medieval dynasties, esoteric brotherhoods, and myths of a world drowned beneath the ocean. At the center of this convergence lies the enduring question: if Atlantis existed, where do its echoes truly hide? And could the Merovingian tradition be one of the pathways through which its memory survived? The final phase of this exploration invites a synthesis, not of concrete facts, but of patterns. Throughout the landscapes once under Merovingian rule, one encounters an unusual density of ancient sites that seem to vibrate with shared purpose. Stone circles precisely aligned as solstices, burial mounds that mirror constellations, subterranean chambers resonating with natural frequencies, and geometric earthworks whose meaning has been lost to time. These structures, though separated by millennia, reflect a worldview based on celestial observation, sacred geometry, and the belief that earthly power mirrors cosmic order. Such principles align closely with the descriptions Plato attributed to the priest-kings of Atlantis, architect-rulers who designed their cities according to harmonious proportions derived from the heavens. Even if Atlantis never existed as a physical kingdom, the worldview it represents existed unmistakably. It appears in the legends of the Tuatha Dé Danann in Ireland, in the Seabringers of the Basque Coast, and in the myths of culture-bearing beings found in Celtic, Gaulish, and Germanic traditions. These myths often describe luminous figures who arrive from the sea after a great catastrophe, bringing with them star knowledge, craftsmanship, and spiritual rites. Over time, these figures evolved into gods, demigods, or ancestral heroes. Behind their stories, however, one senses the outline of real survivors, navigators, astronomers, or priestly refugees from a collapsed maritime culture whose memory endured through myth. The Merovingians emerged in a region steeped in these ancient stories. Their line touched territories once home to druids, megalithic builders, and mysterious seafarers who vanished long before Rome arrived. They inherited a symbolic language older than their own dynasty, spirals, serpents, bees, solar discs, and passed it forward in their regalia, coins, and rituals. Whether they understood the full depth of these symbols matters less than their instinctive preservation of them. Sometimes, cultures protect sacred knowledge not through conscious effort, but through ceremony, tradition, and intuition. It is possible the Merovingians carried remnants of an ancient legacy simply because they were part of the land's deep-rooted memory, the living continuation of a spiritual inheritance hidden beneath layers of conquest and conversion. When examining medieval chronicles, one finds a curious hesitation whenever scribes describe the origins of the Merovingian line. Instead of offering straightforward genealogies, they resort to mythic language, ancestry from beyond the sea, conception through otherworldly beings, kings imbued with a strange divine aura. These descriptions resemble the language used to describe culture bringers in ancient myths, not typical medieval kings. Perhaps medieval scribes sensed something unusual, that this dynasty, though earthly and politically flawed, carried echoes of a worldview predating Christianity and Rome. Scholars often dismiss such claims as romanticized fiction or political propaganda, yet the symbolism outlived the dynasty. When the Merovingians were dethroned, their hair shorn and their power dissolved, their symbols did not vanish. Instead, those symbols were carried forward by groups whose activities remained shrouded in secrecy. The Templars, emerging centuries later in the same regions, adopted esoteric traditions that seem out of place for a medieval military order. The Cathars, in the foothills of southern France, practiced a spirituality that resonated with ancient dualistic cosmologies predating the Christian era. And Renaissance secret societies drew upon symbols that trace back not only to Merovingian times, but to prehistoric Europe and perhaps beyond. It is tempting to believe in a hidden lineage of knowledge, passed quietly through centuries, waiting for the right moment to surface. But perhaps the truth is more subtle. Knowledge may not survive solely through families or orders. It may survive through symbols, landscapes, rituals, and stories that outlast their custodians. The megaliths of Europe still align with the stars, even if few remember why. The symbols carved on ancient stones reappear on medieval coats of arms, sometimes altered but still resonant. Myths of a drowned civilization persist, not because they are accurate historical accounts, but because they speak to a collective memory humanity has never fully forgotten. If the survivors of Atlantis, or whatever real civilization lies behind the myth, carried fragments of their world into Europe, those fragments would not resemble intact libraries or advanced technologies. Time erases details but preserves archetypes. What would remain are patterns, sacred numbers, geometric ratios, astronomical alignments, ritual gestures, and symbolic animals. These patterns appear ubiquitously in early European culture and resurface with uncanny clarity in the Merovingian tradition. The dynasty's affinity for sacred symbols may reflect the lingering fingerprints of an older worldview. There is always a final question lingering at the edge of these mysteries. What does it matter? Why does it matter if a medieval dynasty carried echoes of Atlantis? Why should we care whether knowledge from a vanished world survived through symbols and myths? The answer lies in what these connections represent. They remind us that history is not a straight line from primitive to advanced, from ignorance to progress. Instead, it is a cycle of remembering and forgetting, creation and destruction, illumination and shadow. Civilizations rise and fall, but their wisdom rarely disappears entirely. It travels underground, resurfacing when the conditions allow. Perhaps the greatest legacy of a lost world is not its physical achievements, but the enduring human desire to seek meaning beyond the visible. When we trace these threads through ancient ruins, medieval dynasties, esoteric traditions, and mythic geographies, we participate in the same quest that inspired priests, kings, monks, explorers, and storytellers across millennia. We extend our hands into the unknown, searching for remnants of a truth much larger than any single era. The Merovingians become, in this view, not the custodians of Atlantis, but a chapter in a longer saga, a saga of knowledge carried across epochs, buried beneath conquest, encoded in stone and symbol, and whispered through stories of a world that once was and may never fully be forgotten. Their dynasty serves as a reminder that history's surface is only a thin layer resting atop vast depths we have yet to understand. The echoes of Atlantis, whether literal or metaphoric, continue to vibrate through these depths. They call out not for certainty, but for curiosity, for the willingness to follow ancient paths, decipher forgotten symbols, and listen to the quiet pulse of civilizations long gone. In doing so, we become part of the same timeless search for origins, meaning, and memory that has captivated humanity since the dawn of storytelling.